You said one sentence, and then you let it end. I cannot do it this time. No explanation, no apology, no softer alternative offered before they could feel the loss. For a moment, nothing happened. A cup was placed on the table, someone looked away, the conversation continued, but with a fraction less warmth than before. It was not enough to accuse anyone of anything. Perhaps no one else in the room would have noticed it. Your body noticed immediately. You had disappointed someone, and you had not rushed to rescue them from the experience. The first boundary was so small that no one in the room would have called it a boundary. They had asked whether you could change your plans again. The request was made casually, with the ease of someone asking for what had always been available. You did not raise your voice. You did not explain how tired you were or produce a list of all the other times you had agreed. That was the unfamiliar part. You had said no before, but rarely without building a soft place for the other person to land. You would explain, apologize, suggest an alternative, or offer something else before they could register the loss. Your refusals were usually designed to feel like generosity from the other side. This time, the refusal stood alone. Nothing broke, no door slammed, no terrible confrontation began. Yet the atmosphere had altered, and you sensed that something had been tested without either of you naming it. You were never truly afraid of their anger. Anger would at least have been visible. You could have answered it, defended yourself against it, or decided that it was unreasonable. What frightened you was quieter, the possibility that warmth might become conditional the moment you stopped being useful. Until that moment, you had occupied a role in the relationship that no one had ever described aloud. You noticed discomfort before it became a complaint. You anticipated needs before they became requests. You gave slightly more than was asked, so the asking never had to become a demand. You called this consideration. Perhaps you called it love. From a certain angle, it looked like the most generous thing about you, but consideration does not usually require watching another person's face for weather. It does not require measuring the distance between their words and their silence. It does not leave the body exhausted before an ordinary conversation has even begun. What you were offering was not kindness alone. Much of it had become maintenance. Every relationship has terms. Almost none of them are spoken. They are the conditions under which closeness continues comfortably. The private expectations each person learns to satisfy without discussion. Most of us never discover what those terms are, because they become visible only when someone stops meeting them. You had never tested yours. That is the part worth sitting with. You did not know the terms of some of your most important relationships, not because they were carefully hidden from you, but because you had been paying them so reliably that they never needed to be stated. And so one ordinary refusal became information, not because the refusal was dramatic, and not because saying it made you heroic. It became information because, for the first time, the arrangement had been left unpaid. Later, when the room was quiet again, your body did not feel liberated. Your chest remained strangely alert. Sleep arrived late and shallow. Before morning, you had already formed several explanations that might restore the previous warmth. You could say you were sorry. You could explain that you had been under pressure. You could offer to do it another day. You could make the refusal disappear without technically withdrawing it. This is where the old arrangement is usually restored, not because a person is weak, but because an intelligence trained over many years already knows the price of relational discomfort. It has learned that paying early is cheaper than waiting to discover what another person's disappointment might become. What Jung called the persona is not simply a lie. He developed the idea most fully in 2 essays on analytical psychology, where he described it as a kind of compromise between the individual and society about how a person will appear. It is the social form through which someone learns to belong, function, and remain recognizable to others. The persona becomes dangerous only when it is no longer one face among several, but the sole condition under which love seems available. Yours had taken a very particular shape. You were the one who did not make things harder. You were understanding before anyone asked for understanding. You adjusted without creating a scene. You could absorb disappointment without returning it. This was the offer you brought into your relationships. And an offer accepted quietly for long enough stops looking like an offer. Eventually, everyone begins to call it your personality, including you. Somewhere earlier in your life, disappointment had not been treated as ordinary human weather. It became tension in a room, withdrawal in a face, or a silence everyone was expected to understand. Someone had to correct it, and the responsibility usually fell to whoever noticed it first. You noticed first. You almost always noticed first. So you learned something no one needed to teach you directly. Another person's unhappiness was an unfinished task with your name on it. It was not merely a feeling occurring inside them. It was something you had failed to prevent and were now expected to resolve. That is why their disappointment did not feel like a passing emotion. It felt like something dangerous left running. A pot unattended on the stove, a door that had not closed properly, an alarm sounding in a room that everyone else seemed able to leave. Then the guilt came, precisely on schedule, wearing the face of conscience. It reminded you how little they had actually requested. It accused you of becoming cold. It compared this refusal with everything they had ever done for you. It offered a complete moral argument for why restoring their comfort would be the decent thing to do. But look closely at the timing. The guilt did not appear during the years of quiet overgiving. It did not object when you abandoned your own plans, concealed your exhaustion, or accepted responsibilities no one had formally given you. It arrived the moment the payment stopped. Guilt that behaves like that is not necessarily conscience. Sometimes it is the contract calling. What made the moment difficult was not the refusal itself. It was what the refusal allowed you to observe. In the silence afterward, you learned something about the relationship that years of apparent closeness had never revealed. You learned what happened to the warmth when you were no longer immediately accommodating. Perhaps nothing changed. They accepted your answer, made other arrangements, and returned the next day with the same affection as before. That discovery may have been painful in its own way, because it suggested that part of the old fear had been yours. You had been paying a price no one was consciously charging, or perhaps the warmth cooled by a degree, not enough to prove, not enough to confront without being told that you were imagining things, but enough for your stomach to recognize. A shorter answer, a withheld invitation, a small distance entering the voice, a mood that seemed to require you to correct what you had done. The deepest pain was not the coolness, it was the familiarity of it. Your body knew this shape. It remembered how quickly affection could become distance when you stopped performing the function that kept everyone comfortable. You had spent years preventing this moment, not because you lacked boundaries, but because some part of you already suspected what the boundary might reveal. This does not prove that they never loved you. That verdict would be too fast, and it would relieve you of having to understand the more complicated truth. People can feel genuine affection for someone and still be attached to the version of them that costs the least. They can value your presence while also depending on your self-erasure. Human attachment is rarely pure enough to fit neatly into loved or unloved. They may not know the terms of the arrangement either. Few people examine what they are receiving when it has always arrived without resistance. What feels natural to one person may be the result of years of invisible labor performed by another. The absence of a bill is not the same as generosity, but neither is it automatically cruelty. The harder truth is that these terms were not only imposed on you, you also offered them. You made yourself available before anyone had to demand availability. You removed your limits before another person had the opportunity to encounter them. You did this because the arrangement protected you from a question more frightening than exhaustion. If you were no longer the dependable one, the peacekeeper, the listener, the person who anticipated everything, what would remain between you? As long as you prevented disappointment, you never had to discover whether you were wanted for anything else. The role kept the question closed, and a closed question, however heavy, can feel safer than an open one. The arrangement also gave you a particular form of control. If you could notice every shift in mood and correct it early enough, perhaps no one could surprise you with abandonment. If you remained useful, perhaps affection could be stabilized. You could not force another person to love you, but you could make yourself difficult to lose. This was not manipulation in the ordinary sense. It was adaptation. It was the intelligence of an earlier self attempting to create security from materials that never felt secure. But an adaptation can continue long after the world that required it has disappeared. In Jungian terms, such a pattern behaves like a complex. Jung first identified these structures in his early word association experiments. Collected in the second volume of his collected works, he noticed that certain words produced delays, stumbles, and physical reactions in otherwise composed people. Something organized was sitting beneath the surface, and it answered before the person had time to decide anything. A complex is not merely a habit you forgot to break. It is an organized psychological system with its own memories, expectations, and protective logic. It repeats because it is still performing a function. Until that function is understood, the pattern will continue arranging familiar relationships and calling them fate. Once you recognize its signature, you begin to see the same agreement in other places. It is present in the responsibility you assume before anyone formally gives it to you. It appears when a family gathering somehow becomes your emotional assignment. It lives in the friendship where you are always dependable while the other person is permitted to be complicated. Your body becomes tired before certain encounters because it has already calculated the labor they will require. The important question is no longer whether you were right to refuse one request. That question is almost too easy. The more exposing question is, who have you been allowed to be in these relationships? You have been reliable, you have been perceptive, you have been easy to depend upon. You have been the one who requires very little management. But have you been known? To know you, someone would have to encounter a preference they did not share, a need they could not immediately satisfy, or a limit that inconvenienced them. They would have to meet you where you did not adapt. You had removed many of those moments before they could occur. You gave people access to your care, your competence, your attention, and your capacity to understand them, but you often withheld the very things that would have made a reciprocal relationship possible: your disappointment, your refusal, your anger, your uncertainty, and the ordinary fact that sometimes you would not be what they wanted. That is the real cost of preventing disappointment. It does not merely exhaust you, it keeps the relationship from being tested by reality. You can spend years beside another person without discovering what the bond is made of. Not loved, not unloved, simply untested, and therefore unknown to you. Now one relationship has been tested, perhaps only slightly, perhaps the result is not yet clear, but you cannot entirely unlearn what the altered atmosphere told you. The old explanation was that you were simply generous, naturally accommodating, and happier when everyone else was comfortable. That explanation no longer covers what happened inside you when the warmth changed. Something has ended, but it is not necessarily the relationship. What has ended is your ability to believe that the arrangement was entirely free. You can no longer pretend that all of your giving came only from love, or that no one benefited from your fear of disappointing them. That disappointment is still there. You have not repaired it. You have not explained yourself into innocence or turned your refusal into another form of service. And nothing has collapsed. For the first time, their disappointment is not an emergency addressed to you. It is information. It tells you what the relationship expects, what your persona has been protecting, and what both of you will now have to face if the connection is to continue without the old payment. The first no did not destroy the relationship. It merely allowed the relationship to reveal its terms. Weeks earlier, before any of this, there had been an evening you would not have remembered if the refusal had never happened. Someone asked where everyone should eat. You had a preference. You could feel it clearly, the way you feel a small stone inside a shoe. Then you looked around the table, calculated who would find the drive too long and who had eaten there last week, and heard yourself say that you did not mind either way. The evening proceeded pleasantly. Nobody was wronged. Nothing was lost that anyone could name. That was how the arrangement took shape. The contract had never been spoken, but that did not mean it had no authors. It had been assembled slowly, through acts so small that naming them would have sounded absurd. A plan adjusted before anyone objected. A preference left unmentioned, because mentioning it might complicate the evening. A need postponed until a more convenient moment that never quite arrived. None of these moments felt like decisions. That is why the arrangement became so durable. A conscious decision can be remembered, reviewed, and changed. A reflex leaves no record. After enough years, There was no single choice to reconsider, only a way of being with people that seemed to have grown naturally from your character. You did not become necessary through one dramatic sacrifice. There was no great event anyone could point to and thank you for. Your necessity accumulated quietly, in contributions too small to be counted on any particular day, until the total became too large to withdraw without changing the relationship itself. This is what becomes visible once you stop looking only at the first refusal and begin examining the structure around it. If the terms had ever been written down, they would have read something like this. You may feel, as long as the feeling does not inconvenience anyone. You may need, as long as the need arrives already solved. You may be tired, as long as the tiredness does not change what you do. You may refuse, as long as the refusal comes with an apology attached. You may be loved, as long as you remain the one who costs the least. No one composed those sentences. No one would have agreed to them if they had been read aloud in a room. They were assembled out of small moments by both of you, and they governed the relationship more reliably than anything either of you ever said. You were not merely protecting other people from disappointment. You were protecting yourself from ever having to be negotiated with. A person who anticipates everything is rarely asked to compromise. Nothing reaches the point where two desires must be placed beside one another and compared. You adjust early. The conflict disappears before it becomes visible. Everyone experiences the outcome, but no one has to witness what you surrendered to produce it. That arrangement offered a form of safety you may not have recognized as safety. To have your desire placed on a table beside someone else's desire is to risk discovering how much yours weighs to them. They may consider it, they may resent it, they may ask whether it can wait, they may decide that what they want matters more. You made certain the scale was never brought out. As long as your preferences remain private, they could retain a strange kind of innocence. They could remain important without ever being tested. Once spoken, however, a preference enters the world of consequence. Someone must make room for it, resist it, negotiate with it, or reveal that they do not value it as much as you hoped. You avoided that exposure by becoming easy to accommodate. The irony is that people often admired this quality in you. They described you as flexible, generous, calm, or unusually understanding. They saw the smooth result, but not the disappearance that made it possible. And because their admiration was sincere, you could use it as evidence that the arrangement was healthy. What makes a complex difficult is not its content, but its speed. It carries a charge, and the charge moves faster than deliberation. It organizes perception and reaction before conscious thought has time to intervene. The adjustment is made first, the explanation arrives afterward. By the time you believe you are choosing to be considerate, your voice has already softened. The less demanding option has already been selected. Your own preference has already been translated into something the other person will not have to resist. This is why awareness alone does not immediately change the pattern. You can understand its origin, name its cost, and still find yourself halfway through an accommodation before realizing that no one asked you to make it. Since that first refusal, you have begun noticing the speed of the reflex. Someone asks what you would prefer, and your mind does not search for the truthful answer. It searches for the answer that will create the least friction. You look at their expression. Remember what they mentioned earlier. Calculate what would be easiest for everyone, and then present the result as your own choice. Sometimes the calculation happens so quickly that you cannot separate it from desire. You have spent so long choosing what works for other people that convenience and preference now arrive wearing the same face. This is one of the quieter consequences of the role. You did not merely conceal what you wanted. In some areas, you never remained with yourself long enough to discover it. Being asked directly can therefore feel more exposing than being ignored. If someone overlooks your preference, the old role knows what to do. It adjusts, but when another person pauses and says, "No, what would you actually like?" the familiar machinery has nowhere to hide. You may feel irritation, emptiness, or an unexpected pressure to produce an answer. The question appears generous, but your body experiences it as a demand to locate a person who has rarely been required to appear. Receiving care creates a similar disturbance. When someone offers help without needing anything from you, part of you begins calculating how quickly the balance can be restored. Gratitude is not enough. You want to repay, explain, minimize what was given, or make certain they know you would have managed alone. The care cannot simply land. It must be converted into an exchange before it has time to reveal how vulnerable receiving makes you feel. Giving kept your position clear. Receiving leaves you visible without your usual credential. When you were the helpful one, you understood why you belonged in the room. When someone helps you, your usefulness no longer explains the connection. You are left with the more unsettling possibility that they may be present because they want to be, and you have never learned how to trust a bond that is not constantly being earned. The old arrangement continued because it paid you in certainty. Whatever else remained unclear, you knew where you stood, you were owed very little, and you were difficult to replace. That combination resembled safety because it reduced the chance of surprise. If affection changed, you could work harder. If distance appeared, you could become more attentive. If someone was unhappy, you had a task. A task is painful, but it is legible. Being wanted for no task at all is harder to control. That experiment had rarely been run. You had known what it was to be appreciated, depended upon, praised, consulted, and needed, but you had little evidence of what happened when you entered a relationship providing nothing except your unedited presence. The absence of that evidence formed the quiet center of the entire arrangement. Now the maintenance has begun to stop, and a gap has opened where the labor used to be. Neither you nor the other person necessarily has language for what belongs inside it. This is why the present silence feels so disorienting. You assumed that once you stopped over-functioning, something more authentic would immediately appear. Instead, there may be an interval in which very little appears at all. The conversation becomes shorter because you no longer ask the question that keeps it moving. A problem remains unsolved because you do not volunteer to carry it. A plan develops without your invisible supervision and proceeds less smoothly than it once did. The gap is not proof that the relationship is empty, but it does reveal how much of the apparent closeness had been produced by activity. Remove the activity, and both people must discover whether they know how to meet without it. Other small refusals have followed the first, and they have not felt liberating. The second refusal may have been harder. One no can be explained by tiredness, pressure, or bad timing. Two begin to describe a person, and a person is something you must eventually stand behind. You have felt the old preparation rise before certain encounters. The shoulders lift, the attention narrows. Several possible problems are identified before anyone has expressed dissatisfaction. Sometimes you still solve them, sometimes you do not, and sometimes you notice the impulse fully formed, the explanation, the offer, the reassuring sentence. Then you allow it to remain unspoken. There is a brief interval between the reflex and the action. At first, it may last no longer than half a second, yet that half second contains the beginning of something. Your old role could never permit an opinion that does not exist only to manage the room. It does not feel like courage. It may not feel like strength. Often it feels like delay, awkwardness, or failure. The familiar response is ready, while the truthful one has not yet learned to speak. This is the difficult middle of psychological change. The old function has become visible, but no new identity has fully replaced it. You know what you will no longer do automatically, but you do not yet know what you will do deliberately. There is grief in this stage, because you are withdrawing from something at which you were genuinely skilled. Reading the atmosphere was a real ability. You could detect a change in tone before anyone else acknowledged it. You knew which subject would create tension, which person required reassurance, and which discomfort had to be absorbed to keep the evening intact. These capacities were not imaginary, they were developed over decades. They may have protected you once, they may have protected other people too. It is strange to mourn a talent that kept you absent from so much of your own life. Yet that is precisely what you are mourning. You are allowing a highly developed capacity to go unused, and there is no ceremony for that kind of loss. The people around you may not understand that anything has been lost. They may see only that you are quieter, less available, or unexpectedly difficult to read. They may assume you have become less caring when, in fact, care is being separated from compulsion for the first time. They are adjusting as well. Some have begun asking more directly. This may be uncomfortable in a way you did not anticipate. A direct request can be refused, whereas a hinted need once felt as though it had to be prevented before refusal became possible. When someone says clearly, "I would like you to do this," the responsibility returns to its proper shape. They are permitted to want, and you are permitted to answer. Desire no longer disguises itself as atmosphere. Others may have become quieter. The request is no longer made, and nothing immediately replaces it. You are left with a silence that could mean respect, hurt, uncertainty, or the beginning of a slow reorganization of your place in their life. Part of you wants to ask what the silence means, not necessarily because you want intimacy, but because uncertainty is the one condition your old skill was designed to eliminate. There is nothing wrong with asking honestly, but asking only to make the silence disappear would be maintenance in another form. It would turn communication into a tool for restoring your sense of control. So you wait longer than you once would have waited. You allow another person's expression to remain unread. You let an unfinished exchange stay unfinished. This does not feel peaceful yet. You have not stopped scanning. You have only begun refusing some of the instructions that scanning produces. You are still performing the exhausting first half of the old job without receiving the relief that once followed intervention. Before vigilance ended in action, you noticed, adjusted, and felt the atmosphere settle. Now you notice and remain still. The energy has nowhere familiar to go. For a time, this can feel more tiring than the original arrangement. You may wonder whether you have misunderstood the entire process. Life seemed smoother when you anticipated everything. Other people seemed happier. You knew who you were. The return remains available, and it is seductive because everyone recognizes the person who gives. No one yet knows what to call the person standing in the same room, still perceptive, still capable, but no longer turning every perception into an obligation. You may not yet have a name for that person either. From a Jungian perspective, the unlived life is not composed only of grand ambitions abandoned in youth. It is also made of ordinary experiences that never had enough space to occur. A preference allowed to inconvenience someone, a conversation in which you are not the wiser or steadier person, an afternoon that does not become useful, a relationship in which your value remains unproven and yet your presence continues to be welcomed. These possibilities may not arrive first as desire. They often appear as restlessness, boredom, or a vague sense that the old life has become too narrow. Because you cannot yet name what is emerging, it is easy to interpret the discomfort as evidence that something has gone wrong. But the restlessness may be the first outline of a life that was postponed rather than destroyed. Meanwhile, the terms of your existing relationships are becoming clearer, and clarity is not the same as relief. You may have believed that once you saw the contract, you would be free of it. Instead, you now understand what is expected and remain entirely capable of continuing to provide it. That is a heavier position than unconscious obedience. An unseen contract is a burden. A visible contract becomes a choice. Every time you continue the old arrangement now, you will know that you are continuing it. You may still choose to help. You may still rearrange a plan, carry a difficult responsibility, or protect someone from unnecessary pain, but the action will no longer prove what it once proved. It will not automatically prove that you are good. It will not guarantee that you are loved. It will simply be something you chose to do, and therefore something you could also have declined. This is where care begins to become real, but it is also where responsibility becomes harder. Once the reflex weakens, each act belongs to you more completely. You cannot blame the role for everything you continue to offer. A subtler danger now begins to appear. You may become attached to a new position, the one who is honest now, the one who has boundaries, the one who has done the difficult inner work. You may learn the language of the pattern so well that you can explain yourself before anyone has had the chance to encounter you. This new identity can feel more evolved than the old one, yet it may be built on the same architecture. The old persona secured belonging through accommodation. The new persona might attempt to secure it through clarity, self-knowledge, or perfect consistency. Both promise the same protection if you perform the role correctly. No one will have to decide whether they want you without it. Individuation does not ask you to replace the compliant self with a permanently defended self. It asks for something less impressive and far more difficult, the willingness to appear without knowing in advance which version of you will be welcomed. Sometimes you will help, sometimes you will refuse, sometimes you will discover that you genuinely want to give, and sometimes you will realize that the wish to give is only the old fear returning in a more respectable form. There will be no identity capable of making every choice for you. That is the freedom you were moving toward, and also the uncertainty you spent years avoiding. The relationship has revealed its terms. Now comes the more difficult experiment. Can you remain present when you are no longer paying them? Can the other person meet you where your function ends? And if neither of you knows what belongs in the space that opens, can you resist filling it with another job long enough to discover whether there is a relationship underneath? The first consequence of refusing the old payment was not freedom. It was resentment. It appeared before you had decided what you were angry about. Someone assumed you would rearrange an afternoon. A small responsibility was passed toward you with the same casual confidence it had always been passed before. The request was not outrageous. A year ago, you might have accepted it without noticing what acceptance cost. This time, your body reacted before your manners could intervene. The jaw tightened, heat rose through the chest. Somewhere beneath the civilized answer was a sentence colder than anything you would permit yourself to say aloud. You had expected fear when you stopped maintaining the arrangement. You had expected guilt, uncertainty, perhaps even grief. You had not expected to resent people you genuinely loved, or to discover that the anger felt older than the situation provoking it. The first explanation was obvious. You were finally angry about everything that had been taken from you. That explanation was not necessarily false. It was simply incomplete. The anger accused them of accepting too much, noticing too little, and treating your availability as though it belonged to them. In some relationships, this accusation may have been accurate. There were people who benefited knowingly from your reluctance to refuse. There were people who noticed the cost and decided not to interrupt what served them. But that was not the whole account. Many others had little need to ask because you answered before the question had fully formed. You made yourself available before they had to discover whether availability was reasonable. You removed the awkwardness of requesting, negotiating, and hearing no. Now resentment was presenting them with a bill they had never seen. It was also charging interest on years during which you had insisted, gently and continuously, that there was no charge. Somewhere inside you, a ledger had been kept in a currency you never told anyone you were counting. That is one of the difficult truths of this stage. You wanted something in return for labor you refused to name as labor. Naming it would have made the exchange visible, and you needed the giving to look unconditional because unconditional giving was the kind of love you trusted most. You did not necessarily want repayment in equal favors. The currency was subtler. You wanted permanence. You wanted consideration without having to request it. You wanted the people you had carried to know, without being told, exactly when it was finally their turn to carry you. When they failed to recognize the moment, the old ledger opened. The resentment does not disappear once you understand this. Insight rarely removes a feeling on command, but the anger begins to change shape. Beneath it is a more exposing question, not only what other people took from you, but what the arrangement withheld from them while appearing to protect them. Every time you prevented someone's disappointment, you also removed a choice from them. You decided in advance what they could tolerate. You assumed that a refusal would wound them, anger them, or change the relationship. Then you protected both of you from a test they did not know was taking place. That is a form of authority. It is quiet, often loving, and rarely recognized as power. Yet it still determines what another person is permitted to encounter. You were not merely serving people, you were managing what they would be allowed to feel about you, and controlling what you might ever be forced to learn about them. Here is the shadow inside. The giving prevention can become a verdict delivered before the trial. Some part of you had already concluded that people would fail if given the opportunity. They would choose their convenience. They would withdraw warmth. They would make your need feel excessive. You arranged the relationship so that this expectation could remain protected from contradiction. That is why any recent coolness felt so familiar. With one of them, the answer came back shorter than usual. 2 words where there had been a sentence, a plan mentioned to everyone except you. Nothing you could hold up as evidence, and nothing your stomach failed to recognize. You felt the hurt arrive first, exactly where you expected it. Then, underneath the hurt, something you did not want to look at directly, a small settling, almost a relief. The quiet sensation of a suspicion finally being paid. Part of you was hurt, part of you was also confirmed. There can be a small, shameful satisfaction in watching someone behave exactly as your oldest expectation predicted. The satisfaction does not mean you wanted to suffer. It means the nervous system often prefers a painful certainty to an unfamiliar possibility. If they become cold when you refuse, the old world remains intelligible. You were right to anticipate, right to prevent, right to make yourself necessary. Their reaction hurts, but it also protects the logic around which you organized your life. The greater challenge may come from those who do not punish you. Another of them called the next morning about something else entirely. There was no edge in the voice, no reference to the day before. They wanted to know whether you had seen a particular message, and then they talked about their week, and then they said goodbye in the ordinary way. You stayed on the line a little longer than the conversation required, waiting for the part where it would be collected. It never came. Some people receive the refusal, feel their disappointment, and remain. They do not withdraw affection. They do not demand an explanation. They make another plan and continue relating to you as though your no did not place the entire bond in danger. This response offers no confirmation to the old structure. It leaves you with the unsettling possibility that you may have been preparing for a punishment this person was never going to deliver. Do not turn either discovery into a case against yourself. The old arrangement was intelligent. A person who once experienced disappointment as a threat to belonging will eventually find a way to remove as much disappointment as possible from relational life. One elegant method is to become the person who anticipates everything. But the cost is now visible, and it is not only the cost you thought you were paying. You lost time, rest, and recognition. You also lost the possibility of being surprised. Some people were given very little opportunity to exceed your expectations. Their generosity had fewer chances to become visible because you had already provided what might have required it. They could not choose you at a cost you had removed. They could not make room for a limit they were never allowed to encounter. Whatever warmth they carried toward you remained largely untested. That is the loneliness now appearing beneath the resentment. It is not simply the loneliness of being abandoned. It is the loneliness of standing inside relationships that were never permitted to become sufficient evidence, and realizing that you helped preserve their uncertainty. You do not know what some of these people would have done because you decided too early what they were capable of doing. Projection enters precisely here. In a Jungian sense, projection occurs when an expectation formed within us is experienced as though it were a complete fact about another person. This does not mean their limitations were imaginary. Some were unreliable, some were self-absorbed, some had already demonstrated that your needs became inconvenient the moment they required effort. Projection does not erase those facts. It appears when an untested relationship is treated as final proof that another person could never carry any part of your weight. Your own terror of depending is then experienced only as evidence of their inevitable failure. You saw their limits clearly, but sometimes you saw only their limits. The possibility that they might respond differently when invited into a more honest relationship remained outside the frame. Now that you have stopped automatically adjusting, the results are mixed. Some people remain warm, some become uncertain, some negotiate, some punish, some reveal that the old arrangement was the only form of closeness they were willing to maintain. You are finally receiving information, but it is not a clean experiment. These relationships have been shaped by both of you over years. The other person learned what to expect from what you repeatedly offered. You learned what they could tolerate from situations you rarely allowed to occur. The first refusal does not expose an untouched truth. It disturbs a system and reveals how the system responds to change. That distinction matters. Without it, every awkward reaction becomes proof that they never cared. Every delay becomes manipulation. Every moment of disappointment is interpreted as punishment. The language of boundaries can then become another instrument for reaching a conclusion before the evidence is complete. There is an entire vocabulary available for leaving now. You can say that you finally see clearly. You can say you are choosing yourself. You can describe the relationship as conditional and walk away with your dignity intact and the ledger morally balanced. Sometimes leaving will be necessary. A person who repeatedly punishes your limits is revealing something important. Remaining present does not require tolerating contempt, coercion, intimidation, or deliberate withdrawal used to force your compliance. But leaving can also close the question too early. The old arrangement kept you from discovering whether you were wanted because you never allowed the cost of wanting you to become visible. An immediate exit can let you conclude in advance that you were not wanted at all. Both strategies spare you from uncertainty. What is genuinely required is smaller and more difficult to remain in contact with another person's disappointment without immediately correcting it, and without converting it into a final verdict about their character. You do not have to remain forever. You only have to remain long enough to distinguish disappointment from punishment. Disappointment belongs to every relationship between two separate people. Punishment attempts to make separation impossible. One says, "I wanted something different." The other says, "You will pay for not becoming what I wanted." Your old system treated both as danger. Now you must learn the difference through experience. The body does not find this distinction easy. After enough silence, uncertainty begins to feel like an unfinished emergency. The throat tightens. Attention returns repeatedly to the unresolved exchange. The mind begins assembling explanations that sound calm, reasonable, and completely necessary. Soon, fixing the atmosphere feels as urgent as breathing. You have begun remaining inside that pressure without immediately obeying it. This is the genuinely new act, not managing, not withdrawing, waiting long enough to see what the other person does with a feeling that belongs to them. Sometimes the disappointment passes, they adjust, the relationship resumes, no explanation is requested, and you realize that the crisis existed primarily inside the system, trained to prevent it. Sometimes the discomfort becomes a conversation. The other person speaks more directly than before. You discover that they felt confused rather than betrayed, or hurt rather than hostile. A real negotiation begins where anticipation once prevented one, and sometimes the coldness remains. It becomes clearer, more deliberate, and increasingly tied